Welcome to Podcast Radio.
That, of course, is the great Paul McCartney.
Welcome to Expert Minutes. I'm John Hambone McGuire.
This conversation
Sweet, juicy. Where did that word come from?
I don't know.
Bet you never thought you'd hear that on the radio.
Hi, I'm Graham Mack, and welcome to Podcast Radio's latest Tubecast, which is the behind-the-scenes look at the recording of the interview for the special guest on the Pod 20, which I present on Fridays at 5 p.m. and across the weekend on Podcast Radio. You can catch us on DAB in London, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and online around the world on demand. We've got links from talkers.com, the Talk Radio website in the USA. Find us wherever you can. And enjoy the Pod 20. Now, my guest is Dom Chambers. Dom, you present the podcast inRadio and a couple of other podcasts as well. That's not all you do. Since 2008, you've run Summer Valley FM in Somerset. You started out in hospital radio. You've worked in most sectors over a career spanning 25 years. Let's go back to the beginning. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in two ends of the country, which means I'm extremely comfortable with pretty well wherever I am in the UK. I'm a Hampshire boy, and my parents decided, for reasons that I think remained obscured, but it'd be better if I was at school 250 miles away. So I actually was at school in Yorkshire, and I loved that as well. So really love Yorkshire, really love Hampshire, and a few other places I've dwelt in between.
So that was boarding school, was it?
It was, yeah.
So what was the idea? Isn't it like normally like rich northern people that send their kids to southern boarding schools, or is that just a?
I think that's a lovely idea. But yeah, I think we were the inverse of that. My parents didn't have very much money, but they decided I should go to school in Yorkshire. It was really a Catholic thing, so
I see.
It was
Okay.
just to have the influence of that really, which no bad thing. It was a wonderful school run by monks, and so it gave me a kind of it sort of fueled an inquiring mind. And one thing about a kind of monastic type of education is that they were so confident in what they believed in. Things have changed a little bit now, I can tell you, but we're talking 30, 40 years ago, that they really taught you to question. And I often think about that when I'm asking the questions in interviews. And I, from a young age, had a very inquiring mind. I was very keen to know what was going on in the world around me, and even when I was still at school, and certainly when I was a teenager, apart from the fact that I would describe my teenage years as a conspiracy to spend as much time in the pub as possible,
Yeah.
I was also, in between sort of rounds, as it were, I was quite keen to know what was going on over the horizon, and that started my love and lifelong journey of travelling around the UK and having conversations just to originally to see sort of what makes this country tick, and I really enjoyed a huge variety of things. I spent time in a squat in the Hume district of Manchester. I spent a lot of time in Liverpool as a younger person. I was fascinated by Liverpool. Going to Liverpool almost felt like going to a foreign country. And
people from Liverpool love that about Liverpool too.
Absolutely. I love Scousers, Liverpudlians. And in the 80s, when
The city went broke. Yeah.
When it did, and I interviewed Derek Hatton at a much later date when he was a radio presenter. Interesting career he chose after his. Let's say no more. But it was almost like in those days going to Liverpool was you sort of crossed a border to get in there, and in Thatcher's Britain, it very much felt like. You were going to a different place. And everywhere in those days, everywhere you went, every pub table, every corner, every newspaper salesman, it was one rejoicing, kind of reverberating phrase. We got to get the Tories out. Lad, we got to get the Tories out.
Yeah.
And then it'd be an earnest conversation. And then they break up and said, yeah, but the thing is, we've got to get the Tories out. and I actually went up to Liverpool quite recently. I was a guest from my times in Manchester. I got to know the band James and have remained very good friends with them. And they were doing something Hope and Glory in Liverpool, and I had a few hours to kill in this city, and I hadn't been there for a long time before heading to the centre as a guest of James. And and I decided to recreate a walk I'd done as a student in 1987. And I was more of a writer in those days. And I went round, and there had been riots and all sorts of very unpromising things had gone on. And I described this walk I went on with a lot of destruction, and I was walking through this sort of sea of broken glass, and I stupidly didn't take a name of the street, but I tried to recreate it all those years later in 2017, and it was all so different. It was definitely, there had been some investment, but also a lot of integration with refugees, and there was a mosque there that I don't recall seeing before, and that kind of mixture that you get in many parts of the country where affluence and poverty live bang next door to each other. Interesting, the church in Faulkner Square that was burnt out, and I assume by the Luftwaffe in the 1940s.
It is the Luftwaffe, yeah, at the top of Bowl Street there. It's known as the bombed out church, yeah.
Yeah, but except this particular one, I found out wasn't. It actually was burnt in the 1980s by people unknown, because authorities wanted to close it down and locals didn't. And Sunday, anyway, so that was still there as a burnt out shell. But interesting, you talk about the Luftwaffe, because I remember in the 80s seeing cobbled streets with where the bombs had been, and locals used to put their rubbish in just to sort of get the street level back up. And of course, that would have decayed over the years. And there were actually these divots in the streets which identified old bomb places. But I went on this walk and I found two real lovely dears standing on there. That classic kind of image of working class women buffing up their front step, with that great pride, that home pride, and sort of, Mrs. Mop scarves on their head. And I just bold as brass went up to them. I said, listen, this is going to sound really bizarre, but I was here 30 years ago, and I wondered if you wouldn't mind talking to me. Yeah, we'll talk to anyone. And they were so funny, but a real shade of an old past, and that thing of that spirit of conversation, and I love that. We'll talk to anyone.
Yeah.
And they told me all these. So anyway, when I said to them, I came up with this anecdote about when I was up here 30 years ago. It was always about getting the Tories out, and then of course you had this. The Tories did eventually go, didn't they?
Well, little did they know at the time, but Thatcher had pretty much given up on Liverpool, hadn't she?
Well, absolutely, and
it wasn't public knowledge, but she had. She'd basically said she'd even suggested they just let it rot, kind of thing. Sure.
I think she'd given up on areas of the north of England. I mean, I think this is going back to that Matthew Paris thing about where he describes the country as going into an ideological civil war. Yeah. And I mean, I've always described the Thatcher years as a doctor at ministering to the needs of a very sick patient with an appalling bedside manner.
Yeah.
And so it was fascinating to go back there and have those conversations to see how things had changed. But
it's fabulous now. Liverpool's fabulous now.
It is, and there was. I mean, I'm not politically aligned, but to see the various governments have a go at various parts of the country has been a fascinating thing to witness. Anyway, I did say to these old days, it was all about getting the Tories out. What, and I said, what did you think of the Labour government? And he said, they were as bad as the other lot. So I wondered if we could have a coffee.
It doesn't matter who you vote for, the government always gets in. Yeah, that's
the other thing is I suspect New Labour didn't have much resonance there. I think it was probably more your traditional Labour, but anyway, I think they said they're all as bad as each other.
The problem I think that with the 80s was it heightened an excuse for prejudice against working class people and people from Liverpool, and I think that is how we ended up with the disgraceful cover-up over Hillsborough, because clearly the police messed up and they lied to the Sun, and the Sun took the bait, and they lied and they about whether the gate was pushed open and all this lies and worse. You only have to know what the front page of the Sun said, what all that. But it managed to carry on because of a prejudice that had built up for working class people, Liverpool people, football fans. I think if that had been at a rugby match or a tennis match, or I don't think they would have got away with it. And even today, when they report it, if you look at the memorial at Anfield of the names of the 96, now 97 people who died at Hillsborough, the first thing, because all their ages are up there, and the first thing that hits you is how young some of them were. I think the youngest was 10, and nearly half of them were under the age of 21. But that's never reported. It's, 96 football fans, not 96, people. And nearly half of them, children or very young adults. That part of it doesn't come out. And I still think that's a hangover from what happened in that time, and it's it's allowed it to happen. So that's wow. So you must have a really well-rounded, coming from Hampshire, going to school in Yorkshire with monks, hanging out in Liverpool and Manchester. You probably, maybe you should be a politician. You know what I mean?
I thought about it.
You did think about going into politics?
I did think. I was driven from a young age to do some kind of public service. And it takes a while. I was driven. There's nothing particularly saintly about it. It's or even worthy. I was just driven by a need to help people, and that emerges. I'm just writing a book about this at the moment, and that emerges right from, age 6 when I got a prize for helpfulness. I think they'd given all the prizes out, and they were just wondering what was left for me. And I used to help the dinner ladies bring the the pudding out. And one terrible day, this huge calamity happened where I dropped the entire school's dessert. And my services were less called upon thereafter, but they had awarded me my book for helpfulness. I certainly considered politics, but you know what? I couldn't think of what party to join.
Yeah.
Because there's two kinds of people. You get politicians who deeply and passionately believe in the party creeds and codes, and I couldn't claim to be that. And then you get those who are driven by public service, and then they'll find the most they will find the most appropriate party for them. But there's no way I could have considered becoming a Conservative in the Thatcher years. I actually quite liked John Major, but I'd sort of fallen out of love with the Tories by then, as indeed had the country. And like everybody, I think I was really willing to give New Labour a chance in 97. But they kind of lost me when they started sort of gerrymandering the London mayoral elections and that kind of thing.
The war in Iraq didn't help either, did it?
1 million
an
people
illegal war
out on the streets. 1 million people. How many times in the history of Britain can you say 1 million people went out onto the streets to say, actually, government, this is not a good idea? And that government, which was largely sitting on a sofa in the corner of a kitchen, said, we're going to ignore you. And I think that was an enormous error. And it damaged the reputation of that Prime Minister.
The thing for me is, all Tony Blair has to say now, and he still doesn't say it, is that, look, at the time, with the information I had that said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, I had no reason to not believe that information. It was coming from military intelligence. It was a very credible source. It was multiple sources. At the time, I believed that was what was going on, so the decision to go in there and sort him out was right. But as it turns out, the information was duff, it was false, I don't know why it was false, and the whole thing was a huge mistake based on bad information. All he has to say is that, and I think most people would actually sympathise with him and would go, well, geez, if I was in that position and presented with that information, I probably would have been forced into the same decision. But he's still not saying that. He's still trying to somehow turn an illegal war into something just. I don't understand politicians. They seem to have no shame. There's that bit missing where they can't just hold their hands up and go, "Woof, got that one wrong." They
doesn't happen very often, does it?
No, but it does with minor things, but not something as big as that affected so many people, Yeah. I'm reading a book at the moment from a soldier who went to that war and how messed up a lot of them came back. And, I think in the whole of the Iraqi conflict, according to this book, I forget the numbers, but it's something like only 45 of them were diagnosed with PTSD, when so many others, they said have got personality disorders and all kinds of other blame shifting. But yeah,
And the
it's
consequences remain,
mm,
and I think we can look at that with a great deal, large amounts of sympathy and empathy, because broadening it out into society in COVID and post-COVID, so many challenges are being exposed around mental health and isolation and lack of opportunities, which I think people who go through war. I'm sure you have as well. I've interviewed lots of people who've been in theatres of conflict, and it's amazing how they will block things out. And firstly, they're quite reluctant to share a lot of those experiences with us civilians. They tend to. That's why army reunions and stuff do really well, because they can share with their fellow comrades, even if they didn't serve together. They will understand the milieu of what they're talking about. But in some interviews, people have been generous enough to really open up, and it's at that point you understand how important music is to people in those areas, because music is such a high art form, an emotive art form. It can really displace you, and if you're in a place where you'd rather be displaced from it, then music is the thing that transports you. And so I've interviewed lots of people in that war. The original Gulf War, well, actually, I would say the original Gulf War was the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s. But what we now know is Gulf War One, Schwarzkopf, and all that.
mm-hmm.
Major was prime minister, but that was a war with limited objectives about liberating an invaded country, whereas the second one was really not apparent. And if it was to make it a securer world by removing this ghastly regime of Saddam Hussein, well, it patently did not succeed in doing that. So anyway, I managed to get through all my life without really being that tempted to go down the route of politicians. I know many people in public life, both in Westminster but also in local councils, and largely I really admire them, and I think they take a lot of flack for actually doing some really good stuff. And there's some quite large levels of misunderstandings that goes on, but that never tempted me, and I think it was, looking back in it, always inevitable that I would end up working in the third sector, in the charitable sector, and my media career has very much kind of gone down that route. So any radio skills I've sort of managed to muster over the last 30 years is very much towards serving a charitable vision.
Before we talk about radio, I should just mention that the book I'm reading is called Life After Death, A Guardsman's Tale by James Paul Watson, who's an Irish guard. And the reason why I'm reading it is I'm doing the audio book of it. So I'm having to get pretty close to the story of his, not only Iraq, but Kosovo and Northern Ireland. He served in them all, and a lot of them came back, different people to what they were when they went away. So let's talk about radio then. So what were you listening to when you were growing up in Yorkshire? I mean, could you have a radio in the monastery school?
Well, I mean, like in common with many children of the 1970s, it was the radio secreted under the pillow. Whether you were at home at mum and dad and a bit grumpy with them because they wouldn't let you stay up to watch the Sweeney. The radio was the big, for those of us who went to bed too early to go to sleep. Radio was our internet. Radio was our connection with the outside world. It was our connection with the music that we liked. Because let's face it, records were quite expensive. So you had to do a lot of paper rounds to buy an album. I remember saving with my brother and pooling in contributions to save up for Blondie's Parallel Lines. I think it cost about £4 in 1979. So radio accessed you to everything. And I remember lying in bed at night, listening to Radio Luxembourg, and just sort of transporting my mind to worlds beyond mine. And I loved that. And I loved the voices, some of whom.
So who were you listening to? You're probably listening to like Rob Jones and who was the American guy who wasn't actually American, the Cosmic Cowboy who did the Marlboro Country Music Show. I forget his name.
I tend to remember the ones who then appeared on Radio 1.
Tony Prince. Kid
Prince,
Jensen was on there, wasn't he? Before he
yeah,
went to radio?
and Peter Powell. I
Yeah,
think he was
and Paul
there.
Burnett too. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Steve Wright. I think Steve Wright was somewhere on the Europe. I don't know.
I know
But
Steve Wright was at 210 in Reading,
yeah,
actually with Mike Reed, and they did a show called Reed and Wright. But then
I
Mike,
wonder if that's on YouTube.
I don't know,
Wow.
but Mike Reed ended up at Luxembourg. I don't know about Steve
Yeah,
Wright. Yeah.
yeah. So that's
Stuart
where.
Henry was fabulous on Luxembourg, I
Yeah,
remember, early 80s.
Barry Aldis, remember him?
Yeah.
So the love of radio came from those years of it fueling the imagination, and I loved hearing about news in Hollywood. And I just dreamt of a time when I go there and see these places, which actually happened. Turning that childhood kind of love of connections with the world through radio into a career, that took a lot longer, and I didn't. I went through the whole of school and university without ever once thinking I might need to make a decision about what to do for a living. And then it was I got my degree, and now's that moment.
What was your degree in?
I did a degree, not very well, I have to say. I hardly ever turned up. I was too busy sort of having fun and educating myself, really, in places like Manchester. But I did, in fact, I have to say, and I'd like to pay tribute to them right now, that the University of Surrey awarding me any kind of a degree has to be considered an act of supreme generosity on their behalf, because I simply didn't deserve one. I did a degree in history and English, and what I used to do was I had a motorbike, and I had a social life in London, a social life in Hampshire, and I used to roar down the A3, and then I'd look up to the left as you get to Guildford, and there's the cathedral, and that's part of the campus of the University of Surrey, where technically I was, although I was at an affiliated college in Roehampton at Digby Stewart. And I used to look at it, I thought, oh, I go to college. So I occasionally veer off the A31 and then go into the campus at the University of Surrey and walk into a thing, make a pertinent point about Bismarck's foreign policy in 1888. And everyone would go, who's that? And then I would get back on my bike and head down. I used to do the Hells Angels bashes and all sorts of rock and roll funness in Alresford and Winchester and down in Ocean Village in Southampton. So that's what was really tugging my boat. But I was always fascinated by history, and so I left university with a most inadequate degree, and actually largely went into a distinctly underwhelming career, which changed completely when I became the boss.
And what was it?
What was the
job?
Well, I went when I left university. I did event management, and we called it party organising in those days. So I was a DJ, and I was just thinking, well, how can I turn that into something vaguely sensible? And there was a lot of this was very much sort of tax break party scene in London with the Tory tax break, and that incredible budget of Lawson's in '86, where people had more money, or the right people, or some people had more money, I should say. And there was a lot of money being spent, and that world got taken over by the corporates in the 90s. But in those days, it was very much in private hands. And so I did that, and I didn't really like it. I didn't actually like wearing a black tie and a Grosvenor, doing all this stuff for excessively wealthy people. But unbeknown to them, I used to nick all the stuff and go and do the Hells Angels bashes. And what they didn't realise was that I had two, those bags that cover your suit, suit bags.
Yeah, yeah.
And I had two hanging up. One had my leathers in, and the other had a black tie. And I just had to remember to take the right thing and not to turn up to the Grosvenor with my Motorhead collection. And
so how did that lead you into radio then?
Well, what happened was I left uni in '89, and I thought about journalism because I was a writer. Really. I loved writing. So I rang up my friend Bill Coles, who then was starting his career, which led up to, he worked directly under Trevor Kavanagh at The Sun and was a red top journalist for many years, and he's now a novel writer. But he writes books about people who are in government, who he was at Eton with. But we'll leave that to one side for a second. He was working for a local newspaper in Gloucestershire at the time, and I said, "Can we have a chat?" He said, "Yes, of course." We met in a pub, pint. And he brought his then girlfriend along, who was a radio producer. And after about sort of 15 seconds, I was less interested in what Bill had said. I was absolutely fascinated by what she had said. I said, that's it. It was like the sort of Saul to Paul conversion, a big break in the clouds, and the voice from the thunder said, "You shall go into radio," and that's what it was, and it just seems so obvious, and I don't know why I hadn't thought of it before. I love radio and I love music, and so then it was a question of getting to a hospital radio, there was no community radio in those days, so you've got to find a volunteer sector to get your skills going, and I joined the hospital radio. It was actually part of St George's in Tooting, big NHS hospital still there. But actually, the radio station itself was in what I think would be then called a mental hospital, and off Burntwood Lane in Wandsworth. It's all been built over now. And in fact, I was someone told me the other day that building has been turned into an NHS staff building, so it's still in the NHS. And I lived off Burntwood Lane in Wandsworth, and I used to go and I spent hours up there. I delivered plants for a nursery to sort of earn some kind of living. And I was up there, making little documentaries and having debates about David Bowie's career with the Tin Machine albums and all that stuff, and presenting the obligatory chart show, and wondering what on earth this thing was called 2 Unlimited from Holland. I started out like so many people do, wanting the big Radio 1 show. In fact, that side of things did not work out, but what I got was so much better. And I'm so glad as I steam steadily into my mid-50s, I do not have to earn a living based on the audience figures of my last show. So, and I'm privileged to work in the radio industry, but I don't have to work as a radio presenter.
I think you've maybe visited more community stations than anyone else I can think of. How many have you visited now?
I think that's true. I mean, no one's ever come forward to challenge this. It started out as a hobby. I realized very quickly, don't tell anyone this, but I got a job running a community radio station to set it up when I hadn't really heard of community radio. I was working up at Hallam FM, a commercial station in Sheffield.
What were you doing at
Hallam?
Hallam?
I remember I was in the newsroom there,
okay,
and doing some entertainment stuff, and I remember there was a story about a local radio station coming to somewhere like Chesterfield nearby, and everybody laughed, and I didn't laugh. I thought, actually, that sounds quite sensible. So I sort of spiritually, I think, found community radio before I'd ever heard of it, but when I got the job to set up Summer Valley FM in 2008, I realized very quickly that community radio was going to form a huge part of the radio industry. And that's exactly what's happened. So slightly as a sort of interest in seeing other people, how they're running their stations. And I love, as I've established in this conversation, traveling around the UK. I started visiting stations, and very early on in that, I became the chair of the Community Media Association, which is the national representative body. And so that kind of gave me a bit of a hook. In answer to your question, I've engaged with well over 100 stations. I've actually visited around 75. If I include BBC stations that I've worked for and I visit now, because I work across the industry rather than just in the community sector, and one of the things I do is negotiate the relationship between BBC local radio and community radio. But so I would certainly say I've visited over 100 local radio stations.
Wow. And
over the last 5 years.
Community radio came quite late to Britain, so it probably started. I mean, my experience of community radio is in the early 90s. I was living in Sydney, Australia. I was an air conditioning engineer, and I'd made the decision to get into radio, and I'd gone to a community college run by an ex-DJ that really just took your money off you. But then at the end of the course, I said, well, what happens now? And he said, well, now you have to get involved with community radio, and I'd never heard of it before. But then when it was explained to me, I thought, wow, this sounds like something amazing where people from the local community can get on and have their voice. And I thought, well, there's going to be like, improv comedians on there or local historians or something. And so I went along to my local community radio station, which was called 2RRR, which turned out to stand for Ride Regional Radio. And I used to get into trouble because when I was on the air, I used to say, this is RRR, rock and roll radio. And but the thing was, what I found out quickly was, because you had to bring your own records. And
Right.
It turned out that the only people who had the time to put into community radio in the early 90s were either unemployed or retired. So the format was basically jazz or heavy metal. And it was not put together well at all as a what was it? I have no experience of British community radio. I came here to work in commercial radio.
Yeah.
Probably at about the same time, this is the late 90s, like 97, that was probably about the time when community radio was probably the very beginnings of it in Britain. Did it start off knowing what it was doing, or was it all heavy metal and jazz and retired and unemployed?
It was certainly heavy metal where I was concerned. But I used to go around the wards in hospital, and they say, "Oh, dearie, play us a nice bit of Frank Sinatra. I like a bit of nice Frank, and all this." And I go and saying, "This is a request. I'm afraid we're out of Frank Sinatra, and here's Lemmy from Motorhead." But that was because I rather selfishly wanted to be a rock jock and replace Tommy Vance.
Yeah.
But who could replace Tommy Vance? Well, that was a ridiculous idea.
TV on the radio. Yeah.
What's interesting, you talk about Australia, because Australia is the reverse of the UK in the sense that I think community radio came before anything else in Australia. Before the commercial networks and before the state broadcast. And that reflects those sort of very isolated rural communities in a vast land. Yeah. And interestingly, I was talking to John Bissett, who's sort of the equivalent of what I do at the CMA over in Australia, the Australian Broadcasters Association, Community Broadcasters Association. And we were very much having this sort of compare and contrast about the different histories. And in fact, he's invited me out there to speak at their conference, which I'm really, really looking forward to do. Hopefully sufficiently far away in time for us to be making kind of reasonably well calculated traveling, unlike the holiday makers of this summer. Community radio in this country has existed in one form or another for a long time, as has community TV, but as a licensed model that's come out of Ofcom. It was Tesha Jowell's DCMS that really got this going. And the Community Media Association, which used to be the Community Radio Association, lobbied for it. And the whole thing culminated in the Broadcasting Act of 2003. That behind that, there were what they call the access pilots. So a number of stations were given a license, a temporary license to broadcast and prove their worth. And many of those are still going. What I think no one calculated on is the immense levels of success. And if numbers are a measure of success, I think they are a good measure, no one could have possibly dreamt in those days that there would be over 300 licenses broadcasting. And of course, that's only on FM. There's a number of others coming with the rolling out of small-scale DAB. So community radio it came from, I think, an increased interest in community life, and the radio is an extension of community life.
Well, especially as local commercial radio is disappearing very fast.
Well, one's come to replace the other. What's fascinating about commercial radio is it started out as a local offering, independent local radio, ILRs, and it was independent from the BBC. People sort of forget about that now. And BBC had started local radio in the late 60s, but very much growing in the period where I was starting, a student and starting to get interested in radio in the 80s, as was commercial radio. In fact, as a decision to go into radio, which for me was from about 1990, I think, it seemed a sensible idea. It seemed to be a growth industry.
It was the reason why I came to the UK. I was in Australia, and I'd worked for 3 different commercial radio stations. They get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I was at Knights, just north of Sydney, on the New South Wales Central Coast, a station called 2GO out of Gosford. And I wanted to get off night time. I was on 7 till midnight, Monday through Friday. And I wanted to get off night time and get back into a daytime shift because I'd done breakfast at the other 2 commercial radio stations. But once you get to the bigger stations, they really weren't taking me seriously enough. So, because, I didn't sound very Australian. And so then I heard from a friend, an Australian who'd worked at Ram FM in Derby, and he said, "What are you doing there? It's growing here. It's like these new stations go on the air almost every week." And that was the reason in 97, while I made the move, it had a very, very fast growth. local commercial radio in Britain. It's mostly all gone now, but it was very, very
Well, it was
first.
still quite experimentational. I mean, I've got nothing wrong with, no problem with formatted commercial radio. It's not for me because I like to, I hope
Because
somewhere in here is
you're
a brain.
talented. Exactly.
Well,
Yeah.
I
The
want
format
to
is an
talk.
excuse. If you want to hire someone who's got nothing to say, then you just give them a format clock, and you say you talk there, you say the station ID there, you mention the contest here, you promote the breakfast show here, and then you're back to the top of the hour again. Well, anybody can do that, and it works well if you can't afford talent, and so that's what it is. The funny thing is, though, that format clock, which is something that is, the program director's thing, or now they call themselves a content director, a format clock does not direct programming or talent or content. It's more for distribution. It is how you're going to distribute the music there, the news there, the ads there. And they still think that program directors are actually creative people, and they're not. They're in the distribution game. They're not actually in anything creative at all. They just know how to police distribution.
And there's a place in the marketplace for this kind of radio. For me, I was lucky
in the background.
In the late 90s. I very much sort of found those stations that were trying to be a bit different. I worked for Viva 963, which was the country's, I think, first female radio station, run by Chris Burns, who now runs BBC Local Radio.
Local, she does, yeah.
And I loved that. I mean, that was great. They had me on the graveyard, but I loved being up all night just talking about this marvelous music, and that of course gave way to Liberty Radio, Liberty 963, and that was really, that hit the mood of the arrival of Blair and Cool Britannia. It hit those times spot on, and people were just about hanging on to medium wave. And so they were good times, but I think community radio suited me because I really loved community life, and that just sounds like a thing people say, but for
it sounds
me,
like a slogan, Don. Yeah.
Well, I talk about the conspiracy to spend as much time in the pub. Well, that wasn't just because I liked beer, which I did, but it was about the sort of leveling that comes with pubs, which could have been in churches actually as well.
Yeah.
And for me, community radio, communities start in the pub, and I think radio stations come from that. I was up in the north on one of my tours, and a young student asked me some really brilliant questions actually, and one of the things was, what does community mean to you? And I didn't, when you're interviewed, you don't get a chance to think about the answer. Just something comes out. You hope it's not going to offend or horror people. And I said, well, I was in this pub in Alresford where I come from, and my mate Rick came in, and he said his motorbike had been stolen, and word went out in the pubs, and 3 days later the bike turned back up on his forecourt with a nice buffed up polished petrol tank which had been filled up for the occasion. And I went, that's community. It's that I'm not trying to create a picture of sort of Cray twin type fantasy, but it's that idea of support, that the family unit is the most socially cohesive force in the country, in my view. And that's why when it goes wrong, it can be incredibly tragic. But I think community life is about mates, but it's about, and we've seen this so much in COVID when we've all been under pressure, that the community life keeps you connected. And how important is that? Particularly as we've had to stay in our homes for large slices of isolate, and so feeling connected to your fellow people across the area that you live in, or it might be communities of interest.
Tribes,
exactly, that bring people together because of an interest. An example in radio of that would be Gadio, for instance.
Yeah.
Or you've got various Islamic type stations, and so they're serving communities of interest. Most community radio stations are serving communities of sort of geographic identity. But it's grown, I think, hugely, partly because of that interest in community life has really been redefined. And David Cameron's sort of quite slated for the idea of the big society, but I think he was just articulating something that was happening. and needed to happen. We don't talk about a big society, but the ethos of it, I think, is happening. Certainly where I live, communities have taken charge. They're less involved with the local authority. They're less involved. Local authorities are less involved with education. And every solution produces a whole range of new challenges. But I can really see that the growth of community radio has been part of a growth of community life in the UK. But as a radio professional yourself, you've absolutely rightly identified that the opportunity has been there because the marketplace has shifted in. There's great regional commercial offerings. There's great national commercial and BBC offerings. But I think there's still a real appetite and a need for locally generated audio. And I think community radio, in parts, you can't really say. It's not in the BBC. You know roughly what you're going to get for a local radio station. Broadly speaking, what you can expect. Community radio, have no idea. You can go into an area and listen to one thing, go into another area and listen to something completely different. And that might be a bit rubbish, or it might be exceptional quality, or it might be that you're listening to something that you're never going to hear on any other radio station. And I think, that is one of the great values of what we do, is it's not homogenized. In under current broadcasting regulation managed by Ofcom, not more than one business can own a community license. I think that's really important.
It's a shame Ofcom didn't keep that same. I mean, we wouldn't have this if Ofcom didn't keep a similar rule for commercial radio. And I think a lot of people who used to advertise on their local commercial radio station have been shortchanged by Ofcom. What are your views on Britain's regulator? Because some of their decisions baffle me. I mean, any time I've had anything to do with them directly, because I've been the program director at a couple of stations, and they always seem to be so massively out of touch. I can remember I was at BRMB in Birmingham for a few years, and I was at the BRMB Awards at the NEC, and I was stuck on the table with somebody from Ofcom, which I think the boss thought would be quite funny because I'd had a couple of upheld complaints by that stage, unless he was hoping that we'd build a bridge. But anyway, this guy it was actually the Radio Academy back then, but same people. He was shocked when I told him that the presenters don't pick any of the music. And he had no idea. I can remember being the boss at 2CR-FM in Bournemouth when it was Ofcom, and we had a complaint about a phone call that I'd put to air. And they assumed it was live. And I said, no. And they said, oh, was it in delay? And I went, no. And they said, well, how was it on the radio? I said, well, I recorded it while the song before was playing. They had no idea that could be done. And in commercial radio, that was standard practice. And the reason why I bring up Ofcom is because they've been pretty tough. Although they've been really lenient on the big groups, and we're talking Global and Bauer here. There was one guy was at Capital Extra, was taking payola. He was charging, it was Capital Extra. He was charging £200 for artists to get their records played on his show, and Ofcom didn't do anything about that. They let him go. Meanwhile, Ofcom has been, what looks to me on the face of it, bullying commercial radio. I mean, these are run by volunteers, not for profit, and they've been finding people in breach for failing to log output. One of them, London's Rinse, played a song by J Electronica. Caroline Community Radio was in breach of the broadcast code for playing the song French Kiss by Lil Louise. I mean, that song it's no worse than Donna Summer's Love to Love You Baby, but it seems that Ofcom at the moment are trying to justify their existence by picking on the small fry and leaving the big guys alone. And I don't know why that is. As someone who's so involved in community radio, can you talk about that? Or are you actually scared to say anything in case you upset the regulator?
No, I'm
not
scared
they are powerful.
to say anything. I do think that there are a number of things that should be addressed. One of them is that the regulator has actually shrunk in size. But at the same time... So
who's in that giant building by the Thames then?
Well, I think they got less and less of that giant building by the Thames, but they are still there. But, only recently, I think Ofcom took on the BBC radio, and that was previously self-regulated. So I think they've increased, their portfolio has increased, but at the same time, their staff has shrunk. And I think at the background here, and this is a personal opinion, I do think that there is a government who at one point, or what this government came out of, a previous version of it, were quite keen to lose Ofcom totally. So I think there has been an element of trying to justify themselves. And one quarter of all community stations were threatened with being found in breach a few years ago for not filling out their annual reports correctly. And I was chair of the CMA at the time, and
during a pandemic as well.
Well, no, this was before, but it was. Okay. So what is going on here? And I think the answer is that was in the lead up to the 2015 election. So let's flex the muscle. Ofcom do, I think, a lot of good work and a lot of necessary work. But one thing that frustrates me, and I can hear managers and program controllers up and down the country on this one, is that Ofcom will investigate a complaint on its own merits, and that is right and proper. But the fact is, he's really become an agent, an unwitting agent in vexatious activity, and I'm sure this percolates throughout across the sectors. But you talk about volunteers in community radio. Managing volunteers is a very, very advanced skill set, and it's a very rewarding one, I can tell you. But the chances are that every now and again you're going to get someone who's a bit hacked off, and then where can they go? They've lost their place in the community because their show is no longer going out. And I always think that as a program, as a manager myself of 12 years standing, that if a complaint goes direct to the Ofcom because it's citing some potential contravention of the broadcasting code, and they haven't gone to the management of the station, that automatically, to my mind, indicates a vexatious aim.
Well, it shouldn't even be allowed to be that way. My view of it is that if a listener, and I used to pride myself at 2CR, that if a listener came to me first, I had a 100% record of them not going to Ofcom after they'd spoken to me. Because I'd listened to their concern, we'd talk about it, they had a genuine concern. Most of the time, they just wanted the radio station to be better.
Genuine complaints from the community, from listeners, will go to the manager. But
Ofcom should have a rule, and it should be you go to the radio station first, and if you're not happy with how you dealt with or whether it wasn't resolved, then you go to Ofcom afterwards as an overseer. You shouldn't be allowed to go to Ofcom in the first instance, especially when there's only one complaint. People's careers have been ruined because of one complaint. If you get 100 complaints, well, maybe. But you should have to go to the radio station first. And if the radio station... What's that?
And that does happen. You do get something that's gone wrong in broadcasting, and you get hundreds or thousands of complaints.
Sure.
That's a different thing. But what we're talking about here...
were all the ones I just mentioned were all based on one complaint.
Exactly. And I was sat at this desk here when I was running Summer Valley FM only a year or two ago, and I took a telephone call, and it was the mum and a mum of driving her children around. She said, "I'm a bit worried about what I'm hearing on the radio." I said, "What are you hearing?" And she said, "Well, my children are listening to a song, and I'm not going to say what she thought she heard, but I can tell you that she had misheard Sylvester's 'Do You Want to Funk With Me?'" And so that was sort of very easy. But she was a concerned mother. She rang the manager. We sorted it out. Had a bit of a laugh actually, and done and dusted.
Yeah, and that's it.
Yeah,
and you've made a stronger bond with your community, not a weaker one. You've strengthened the bond instead of weakening one. If they go straight to Ofcom,
I think Ofcom need to address this, and I mean they're certainly aware of it. But with community radio, there will be volunteers who want to keep a sort of voice alive, and one way they can do that is by complaining about the people they were formerly supporting. And I think this is getting bigger. There's more community stations, and there's less local commercial stations so there may be less from that sector. I don't know, But it's something that I will be raising with Ofcom, and I will give them. I'm not just going to lunge at them in a meeting. I want a very serious debate about this, because I think there's an appetite. And the previous thing, that every complaint will be investigated on its own merit, is fine. But I think we need to now really bring it into this wider context. And you know what? Ofcom are pretty taxed on their time. They've lost a lot of staff members. I think it would be a relief to them if they could find a way around this. And as you say, start with a complaint with the people who you think have made an offence on air. And yes, the higher levels of stuff, incitement to racial hatred or something
absolutely,
like that.
absolutely.
That's a matter of the law of the land.
Exactly. When we're getting beyond broadcasting code and we're into actually breaking the law, that's a different thing. Well, you can go straight there with that kind of thing. But if it's, I don't know. So tell me about this book you're working on.
Well, I run a charity called the Summer Valley Education Trust. And what we do is it started because of the training in community radio. And then I realised that the training was having of young people, particularly because the station I ran linked to local education opportunities for kids to get a bit of skills-based learning, and it had consequences beyond just learning how to do radio, which is a fine and honourable thing, of course. But this was helping people with their self-esteem, their mental health. To gain skills that are transferable, to make you more employable, all the things that is can be very problematic for young people to achieve and gain. So I started a charity that did this, and in fact we've now branched out into music, so we get the same outcomes, but we have music training as well, and I work with local youth services, so we can target people who really need these services, i.e. kids without progression plans, 16 to 18, kids vulnerable to exclusion or falling into a life of crime, and the police support us for this kind of work. Anyway, I started the charity 2017, and it was always pretty ambitious, but it's steadily grown. We're just coming to the end of year 4. We will have a turnover in excess of 100,000, which means we'll be a medium-sized charity. And this is a charity with a national vision. And one of my trustees, who's an impressive person called Lucy Nelson, who started the charity Tommy's, which does really important work when pregnancies go wrong for one reason or another. And she said, your story is pretty amazing, Dom. You should tell it. Now, I've been down, bloke at bar in the pub. I've got a book to write. We all have, don't we? And I did for years, and I tinker with a bit of writing. I actually wanted to call a biography for reference and research purposes only, after a Billy Connolly gag where he's describing how his driver, right? And he goes, I'm not going to try the accent. He goes, in a moment of weakness, my driver purchased a top shelf magazine, and he left it on the back seat of the car. Where? For reference and research purposes only. I picked it up and had a look, and I thought there's something really deliciously British about that, isn't there? And so I was writing that. Anyway, Lucy, one of the trustees of the charity, said, you should write a blog, you should do something. I thought, I'll just start and see what happens. Anyway, I've worked out, because I'm involved in so many things, I have to be really quite organised and have quite a structured working day so that I get everything done. And if I want to do something, it has to go into my working schedule. So to get fitter, I actually have a personal trainer who turns up, and I just block it out in my diary like a meeting, and losing weight and generally kind of getting on well. So it goes into my working day. And I decided that the way to make this happen would be to dictate a book. I had no idea if I could dictate a book or not. But I thought, if it's down to me to write, well, I spent a lot of time writing copy for funding, narrative, and stuff that's really important for my professional landscape. And I thought, I'm never going to write a book if I've got to write it. So I put an advert out on LinkedIn asking for somebody to take dictation. And all my techie friends came back and said, what are you doing, Dom? Let's buy the software. I said, no, you're missing the point. I want to see the human reaction to what I'm writing. And I found somebody who's a professional typist called Emma. And we do this on Zoom every Friday at 2:30 in the afternoon. We meet on Zoom. She types, I talk. We get about 2,500 words knocked out and very nearly finished with the book. So right from the start, when I decided to write a book, I I thought, well, it's got to be called Sound Vision.
Yeah.
And then as this was sort of becoming a reality, and I realized I was going to have a book out by the end of the year. I thought, actually, that's a better name for the charity, because I started out wanting to create a charity that had an association with Summer Valley FM, because we were very known locally for the sorts of work that we were doing. And I wanted to appeal to the local funders. Well, strategy worked. Done and dusted. We steadily grown for those first 4 years. But now, as we scale up nationally, which is what the plan is, then we don't want a charity with a geographically identified title. So Sound Vision is, I can state this publicly now because I've had it trademarked, and that will be what the charity. When the trustees have agreed, we're going to change the name of the charity during the autumn to become Sound Vision, and the book will be published. There's no attempt to make money here, because you don't really make money out of books, unless you're a professional reader reading them, maybe. But we'll have a conversation about that, because the audio version will come out before the published version.
Yeah,
And
we can do that.
Although I suspect it may need to be my voice.
It will be your voice. But if you want any tips on how to do it, shortcuts.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Hopefully, in post-COVID times, we can meet and have a pint and talk about it. But
Yeah.
so the book has turned out to be a much greater project, but wonderful.
So what's the title of the book now then? Is that Sound and
Sound
Vision?
Vision.
Oh, okay.
No, not and Vision.
Right.
No, I leave that to a company that will supply your plasmas, and also the memory of a tremendous David Bowie hit in 1977.
So Sound Vision.
It's just Sound of Vision.
Not sound.
It is a vision. What is very sound?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then when I said earlier in this conversation that all the radio skills, such as I have mastered over the last 30 years, is about driving that vision forward. And it's a vision that really improves society through the media. And I do a lot of public speaking. You start, say it's Rotary or WI or something locally. I always say, well, let's have a hands up. What do you think of the media? A few hands will go up, and they will always come up with a negative. People always start with a negative about the media. So, they've done this, or they've done that, And of course, that is absolutely true. The media can do terrible things, or people working in the media can do terrible things. But it's also it has fundamental roles in society, in holding people to account and doing all sorts of things. But I'm arguing, and it's not just me. There's lots of people thinking this way now, that media, community media, grassroots media, non-profit media, volunteer-orientated media linked to the third sector, by which I mean the charitable sector, is an agent of good. It can impact on people's lives really positively, on the lives of their communities and society in general. And I think this is really, really exciting. I think the times are right now for this kind of approach to media, and I like the fact that we attract, in the charity that I run, young people. I'm a trustee, as you know, of the Radio Academy, and one of our big debates is, obviously we're there to talk about the future, and how are young people going to get on in a fast-moving landscape, and so we're attracting children and young people. We don't talk about radio with them. We talk about podcasts.
Yeah.
They would probably recognize YouTube before they recognize the BBC logo.
Yeah.
So we are bringing. I think there will always be a need for audio, information, and entertainment, and that's the beauty of the growth of the podcasting approach. In terms of how local radio will develop, I think that the podcasting side of local radio will be as important as linear listening in years to come. So Summer Valley FM will have the weekly or daily, possibly even Summer Valley podcast, which gives you 20 minutes when you're walking the dog in the evening. And then you're kind of tapped into your community. The beauty of audio, as we all know, is you can be doing other stuff.
Yeah.
You can't, until we get to the driverless cars, which probably aren't that far away, but for years seemed very futuristic. You can't read a book or watch television when driving a car. You can listen to the radio, and that's how That's how you sort of. It's back to that thing we talked about. The child lying in bed, being fueled their imagination and their knowledge. Well, it's still there, isn't it? Because when I'm out and about and I'm listening to Radio 4 or LBC or Steve Wright in the afternoon or Johnny Walker, whoever it is, or little weakness for Absolute, I have to say. You're still getting it through the radio waves. But the kids are coming in here. They're making podcasts about the world that affects them. Kids are much more empowered in many ways than they were when I was a child, and they're knowledgeable. They don't necessarily have the emotional maturity, and we can help with that. We can say, actually, that's maybe not such a good idea to have that approach. But you wouldn't expect them to have the emotional maturity. They're still children. They're still young people. But they're fascinated. They're really interested in all sorts of things that will be of parental interest and concern: drug taking, self-harm, mental health in general. And you know what? The children that are most afraid of, that come to us, is they're most afraid of being laughed at. If you can set up and organize a place, a safe place, which is geared up for the well-being of young people, the well-being of people, actually. And they will come in if they don't think that they're going to be laughed at. We very much describe it as non-judgmental. You can come in and be free to experiment. And in this atmosphere, you get people who don't speak up in class, who don't speak up in the playground because there's someone bigger and better looking, or the bully who's commanding the attention. And then we find that they're very enfranchised through that. So they're getting a bunch of skills and confidence and self-esteem, their sense of their own worth is increasing. But they're also getting a voice and a platform. And one of the key things of sound vision is empowering voices less heard. And one of the things we're going to do is revisit, and I'm having some really interesting conversations, that wonderful charity that sadly is no longer, Sound Women, which I think was doing important work. And I don't think it was grassroots enough, frankly. And I said that at the time because I was involved. But I think that the empowering female agenda, quite rightly very big at the moment, is an area that we're very interested in. And it won't, it's not just about me. I employ a great team, a growing team, and they come from all sectors of society where we're particularly kind of keen to target what we're doing. So, that's the long version. What I call it is media with good stuff, really. It was possibly the title of the second book.
And let's talk, well, we're on podcast radio, so we should
we
talk about
podcasts.
Yeah. So let's talk about the podcast that you're involved with.
Sure. Well, inRadio is an example, actually, of very nice timing, Graham, because it's exactly what we're talking about. Radio Today, Roy Martin started. He wanted to create a kind of radio station for the industry,
and he did for a while.
And he did. It was called inRadio, and but I think it was a bit of a labour of love and a bit of a strain on his time, I suspect, and not one that was particularly monetizable. And but he reached out to various sectors of the radio industry, and so you had a students show and a community radio show and hospital and so forth. And he asked me to lead up the community sort of contribution, which I did. And then when he pulled it, we had a conversation, and I said, well, actually, I'd still like to do this kind of approach to local radio, which is about education. It's about all the things I've just articulated. And so the way this settled down is that you've got the Radio Today podcast, which is about what's happening in the industry, and a fine weekly podcast it is too. And you've got the inRadio podcast, which explores more the kind of the social worth of radio, of community, of grassroots, but the educational side and the skill development side, which sounds quite serious. I think we have.
It's quite entertaining. You get some really good guests on. Yeah.
Yes. Well, who can say no, really? I mean, the beautiful thing about what I do is that it's not controversial. It's people love the idea that the industry that they love is doing this kind of is an agent for social change and for great impact on people. And I think people are also interested in the idea that the local radio marketplace has shifted hugely. It continues to shift, and I like highlighting. I see validity in all. I don't say, well, I'm not going to go to that station because it's a bit crap, and it may not be. But and one of my favourites in radio podcast actually is, or one of my favourites is, I went to 20 stations. I went on a tour of 20 stations, and I put this out for World Radio Day in February. And to hear 20 stations in one podcast was a bit of an editing job, I can tell you, but hugely rewarding. And for people, you see, I work in the community radio sector, so I'm very familiar with it. But for other people who, are still a bit naive about it, they might say, well, that's kind of a bit of a crap section of the industry. They might think it. They probably wouldn't say it these days, but they might think it. And so the idea of enfranchising, if you like, community radio and the grassroots approach to media is huge fun, but I think needed. And I think that's why Roy wanted to support this. And that said, I haven't done one for a bit, so this conversation is rather encouraging me to get. I've just joined.
But you're busy doing other podcasts as well. So how you find the time?
We get commissioned, you see. So I've developed a niche for the charity. So we do the DHI podcast. With DHI stands for Developing Health and Independence. It's very much located here in the West Country, which they're given the sort of sort of mental health recovery services for people who've had addictions to alcohol and drugs and so forth. And it's so exciting and interesting. I can get an expert on, and I do, who will tell you, look, drinking to excess is not a good plan. You put them in front of school children and say, yeah. We all went to the drugs lectures at school, but some of us became drugs addicts, So it's a question of how you get those messages across without being preachy, po-faced, and general telling people what to do from a paternalistic kind of with your waggly finger point of view. And so we will get experts on. But if you've got a woman telling you that she had decided to take her own life and it wasn't worth living anymore because of her addictions, and so she decides to jump off a bridge into a river and end it all. And at the very moment she lets go, she wants to live. And then she hits the water and it's icy cold and she's afraid of dying. So in that second was a complete reversal of her mental approach to life. Clearly she survived. And she to tell me the story. And I learnt more about that whole world through that one interview, because it's an incredibly powerful story. And I don't know anybody in adult life who's not affected one way or another by the issues surrounding drugs and alcohol. And so these are issues that are very much, it's rather like being the vicar and having to deal with people's loss of life. That is part of life, losing life, people losing life. It's part of life. And I think so the DHI podcast is a really important way of carrying a message, but it's about stories. I think all podcasts really are about stories and empowering people to tell those stories. But somebody's stories of lived experience is going to take messages much further. We launched the Well Wessex podcast, which is Well Wessex. It's also started by Lucy Nelson. Is an unconstituted umbrella organisation that brings the work of the 4 leading mental health charities of Somerset together. And the Well Wessex podcast sort of highlights these things. So if you've got anxiety, you've got you're afraid of going outdoors, but you need to keep fit, and all these things, the stuff that affects us all really. 5 ways to well-being, and so it's not only about a podcast people can access because it'll inform or even entertain the world that they're interested in. But it's about empowering people with lived experience to make those podcasts. And that's when you get the real stories. So my trainers and myself guide people in making podcasts of real social value. And that's an extremely exciting and thrilling thing. I stumbled across podcasts completely by accident. I was commissioned, this was years ago, 12 years ago. I was talking about podcasts 12 years ago. And Bath and North East Somerset Council, who really heavily supported the creation of Summer Valley FM in a way that just simply wouldn't happen now because of the strains on public finances. And they were very pleased with what happened with Summer Valley, and so they kept coming to us, and that's how I started training people in how to deal with hostile interview techniques and things like that, which I was worryingly good at. I've never done a hostile interview in my life, and it turns out I'm a real bastard. I hope I can say that on your show. I'm really nasty. I didn't know I could be. Anyway, so they rather like me when I come in to tell them, give them such a horrendous experience. The hope is that they will never actually have that when they're at the BBC. Anyway, they said, would I make podcasts about, because they had a monthly magazine which highlighted things like, the Christmas lights switch on, public community events and village days and all the stuff, as well as, the more mundane things around refuse collections and things. And they sent me the content, what they wished to do, and I put all this together. And I liked it. I really enjoyed doing that. So when the podcast thing took off, I think my conversation with Roy was a long time ago. It feels like it's been about 5 years. And then I realized it could be revenue. So for the charity, and we get commissioned to make podcasts as well. But I still have this huge affection for the inRadio podcast. And there's a strain on my time at the moment, but I've got so many podcasts to release. It almost pains me to reflect it. I've got some wonderful conversations, talking about some great guests. Johnny Beeling spent an hour with me the other day,
ex-Radio
and
1,
talking. Yeah. Oh yeah, and he was the sort of radio boss god, and I would tremble at the thought of writing to Johnny Beeling, but those days when we all listened to just a handful of stations, and actually getting his story was wonderful, and talking to the guy who ran the radio station that I used to listen to when I was bullied at school, because that was my only friend, and I'm not making this up. That is absolutely true. 13-year-old me, 1980. Out of sorts with the world. I mean, who isn't out of sorts with the world when you're 13? You're just sort of hanging around waiting to be 16 and a bit older and old enough to get to the pub with friends and have friends. But I didn't. I used to paint because I was creative. And I spent that summer with an easel, painting nature, and a transistor radio, and Smiley Miley and the roadshow. And I was telling him this, and then he was telling me from his point of view what they were telling. He created the roadshow, Johnny Beeling. And so that was a wonderful conversation. And inRadio is the vehicle where these conversations happen. In fact, Roy got me a new jingle made the other day, which is inRadio Conversations.
Yeah.
There's conversations exactly like this, where you don't need to have all those production skills to chop it around to create a story. Just go and talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And I mean, my challenge is that I'm not really, unlike Roy actually, and so many other people I'm not really motivated by technicalities. I'm motivated by the outcomes.
Yeah.
I just like radio because it's like a painting. You either like it or you don't. It's the Oscar Wilde approach to art. Good art is stuff you like, and bad art is stuff you don't like. And so sometimes when we're doing stuff on Zoom, I'm thinking, it's not sounding quite right. I don't know what to do about it. But so luxury to I've just joined John Dash and team at Care Radio, and where there's a producer producing my show Life Stories, and it's wonderful working with a technically really proficient person, because I can just focus on the wonderful conversations, and what brilliant timing that was of John and everybody and Gary to release Care Radio at this time of focus on the NHS. But the NHS is a major agency of care in this country, but actually so many people are carers who aren't supported. including children.
Yeah,
This is
yeah, they
something
are.
that we need to. And a lot of people are carers who don't realise that they're carers.
That's right. Yeah,
Because they
they're
just
just
think it's
their spouse or
duty.
whatever. Yeah,
Exactly, within their
yeah,
marriage or within their
yeah.
family unit. So I love doing the inRadio podcast. I'm really looking forward to getting back to it, and I've got a number of students I think which are going to help me. In fact, I just put out as chair of the Community Media Association that we're looking for work placement opportunities. And we can link it because the Radio Academy have got a mentoring scheme. So there's other wider networks we can link it into. But I love the idea, and I have launched many careers. Actually, I haven't launched any careers apart from my own. But I have facilitated environments where some wonderful careers have been launched, and it starts because they want to try themselves out. They come and do that with me, and then ultimately that becomes useful. So people have on their CVs the inRadio podcast because they've produced it, and then of course they move on, and hopefully someone else comes in. So I'm building an army to get some more podcasts out there. Really.
But it's an army that's going to use its powers for the forces of good and not for evil.
Oh, absolutely. That's that is absolutely that I can safely say underwrites what I do. It's a force for good.
Dom Chambers, you are a force for good, and it's been great spending this time with you and finding out more about all the things you've got going on, including the inRadio podcast, which I think is the thing that we're most interested in, podcast radio, but it's just the tip of the iceberg of the stuff that you're involved in. Thanks for all the work you do, and thanks for your time. Where can we find out more about you or the organisations you're involved with?
Well, at the moment, the charity is called the Summer Valley Education Trust, and there's only one of them, I can tell you. There is, interestingly, another charity called Sound Vision, but it looks after the interests of Muslims in Chicago. So I think thematically and geographically, we're sufficiently far removed.
There won't be a confusion, I don't think.
No, I don't think so. So look out for Sound Vision as it's coming soon, and I'm not far. If you Google Dom Chambers, there is a magician in Australia, but I can categorically say that I'm not a magician in Australia. But I'm not far from that. I chair the Community Media Association. I was until recently chairing the Audio and Radio Industries Fund for Emergency Fund for COVID, for people in the industry who had lost income because of the circumstances they found themselves in 2020. And I love being a trustee of the Radio Academy. I think the Radio Academy has such a great history, but where it is now is very much, it's a contemporary charity, unbelievably well managed by Sam Bailey, and well chaired by Helen, and I think it's got so much to offer, and we're going to see a lot more of that. And it is, we want to give people opportunities. We love the radio industry, and we want to encourage young and emerging talent. And frankly, community radio is the big training ground. Not to say that student radio isn't doing a fantastic job as well, and there's strong overlaps between community and student. And of course, hospital radio is still a phenomenon as well. And I think at the Academy, we want to very much make sure that there's an industry around that's relevant to young people, and there's places for them in it, because there needs to be, and it's a fast evolving landscape, this. And we not only want to feel that young people feel included, we want the industry to benefit from their energy, from their creativity, and the world of media that they want to create. And what I do through the Community Media Association and the Radio Academy and my own charity is very much encourage that. Of course, what the charity does is it takes it one stage further. It's not just about people wanting to be professionals. They're with us and they're welcome. But this is about all the benefits that you can get from this sort of approach to the media by being included. And that is the key word, feeling included.
Dom Chambers, thanks very much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, Graham. Thank you.